Мы действительно готовы к ядерной войне?
Ну, с военно-технической точки зрения мы, конечно, готовы. Они у нас постоянно находятся в состоянии боевой готовности. Это первое. А второе, и это тоже общепризнанная вещь, наша триада, ядерная триада, она является более современной, чем любая другая триада. Таких триад только вот у нас, да, американцев, на самом деле. И мы здесь продвинулись гораздо больше. У нас она более современная, и вся ядерная составляющая.
Of May 2023. The Russian missiles were exploding in the air all over Kyiv. And on the ground in Moscow, tanks, soldiers, and thousands of people were lining the Red Square for Russia's annual military parade. It was Russia's Victory Day, the most significant day in Russian President Vladimir Putin's calendar. Putin has long used this day to rally public support, to demonstrate the country's military might, and rail against the historical injustices that he says Western nations have heaped on his nation. For years now, the Russian leader has led the annual military parade in the Red Square, with displays of military hardware that includes tanks, missiles, and other weapon systems. The day is an exhibition of patriotism, marking the Soviet Union's role in defeating Nazi Germany in World War II.
Уважаемые граждане России, дорогие ветераны, товарищи солдаты и матросы.
In his address at the Victory Day military parade, Putin told the Russian military personnel that the country's future rests on Russian soldiers fighting in Ukraine.
Мы гордимся участниками специальной военной операции, всеми, кто сражается на передовой, кто под огнем обеспечивает фронт, спасает раненых. Нет сейчас важнее дела, чем ваша боевая работа. На вас держится сегодня безопасность страны. От вас зависит будущее нашей государственности и нашего народа.
With the war now in its third year and Putin set to be re-elected for a fifth term, we focus on the past and current state of Russia's military arsenal. On the 24th of February 2022, just before dawn, Putin began what he called a special military operation. In the invasion, dozens of Russian missiles struck cities all over Ukraine. Russian ground troops moved in quickly and within a few weeks controlled large areas of Ukraine and advanced to the suburbs of Kyiv. The invasion became the largest attack on a European country since World War II. The Russian military battered wide areas in Ukraine with airstrikes and conducted major rocket and artillery bombardments, resulting in large numbers of casualties. Let's take a look at some of the weapons used in this conflict. The Russian military used warplanes and Kaliber cruise missiles to hit facilities throughout Ukraine. The 3M-14 or the SSN-30A cruise missile, commonly referred to as the Kaliber missile, is a precision weapon. It can be fired from ships or submarines toward land targets and travels a maximum range of about 2,400 kilometers. To hit key targets, the Russian military also used Iskander missiles that have a range of up to 500 kilometers. They carry a much more powerful warhead that can destroy big buildings and even fortified facilities. The Iskander short-range ballistic missiles became common in Russian attacks on Ukraine. They are carried on a road mobile system that is essentially the back of a truck, as opposed to being launched from a fixed site. Some Iskander missiles were reportedly fired from the territory of Russian ally Belarus, that has served as a staging ground for the Russian invasion. The Iskander was first unveiled in 1996 to replace the Soviet Union's Oka ballistic missile. Oka was discontinued under the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, or INF Treaty. In 2006, the Russian army officially adopted the Iskander-M missile system. Alongside modern Western arms, some Soviet-designed machinery are also in use. Grad, Smerch and Uragan multiple rocket launchers are designed to fire powerful rocket salvos to destroy concentrations of troops or military equipment. Their use in populated areas inevitably causes heavy casualties and major damage to civilian infrastructure. The Russian military uses a wide range of powerful Soviet-designed artillery units that are interestingly named after flowers, like the self-propelled 203mm Peony and the 152mm Hyacinth and Acacia self-propelled howitzers.
По основной точке наводки 55-31.
The Russian army's offensive in Ukraine requires a vast amount of military equipment, weapons and vehicles. BM-21 Grad is one such weapon. It's a self-propelled 122mm multiple rocket launcher designed during the Soviet Union era. It has been in service since 1963. Both the Russian and the Ukrainian militaries have this truck-mounted multiple launch rocket system in their arsenals. Another Soviet-era machine that played a pivotal role in the war is Tu-S4 Tulpan, popularly known as Tulip. Russia had unleashed this gigantic Soviet-era Tu-S4 Tulpan 240mm mortars on the Azovstal steel plant in the southern port city of Mariupol, a city in Ukraine. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine launched by Russian President Vladimir Putin is now in its third year. On the 29th of February, in a State of the Nation address, Putin vowed to fulfill Moscow's goal in Ukraine and warned the West against deeper involvement in the fighting.
Заговорили о возможности отправки на Украину натовских военных контингентов. Но мы помним судьбу тех, кто направлял когда-то свои контингенты на территорию нашей страны. Но теперь последствия для возможных интервентов будут гораздо более трагичны. Тоже есть оружие, да, знают об этом, сейчас только я сказал, тоже есть оружие, которое может поражать цели на их территории. И что все они придумывают сейчас, чем пугают весь мир, что все это реально грозит конфликтом с использованием ядерного оружия, а значит уничтожением цивилизации. Они чего, этого не понимают, что ли?
The war in Ukraine has triggered the worst crisis in Moscow's relations with the West since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis.
I call upon him further to abandon this course of world domination and to join in an historic effort.
The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was a direct and dangerous confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. It was the moment when the two superpowers came closest to nuclear conflict, and history seems to be repeating itself in the current times. While Putin has previously spoken of the dangers of a confrontation between the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and Russia, his nuclear warning at the recent event was one of his most explicit. Putin's warnings underlined his readiness to raise the stakes in the tug-of-war with the West to protect the Russian gains in Ukraine. Speaking ahead of the presidential election, Putin lauded what he said was Russia's vastly modernized nuclear arsenal, the largest in the world. The annual threat assessment released by US-based the Director of National Intelligence, or DNI, says that Moscow still holds the largest and most diverse nuclear weapons stockpile, and that Russia views its atomic weapons as necessary for maintaining deterrence and achieving its goals in a potential conflict against the United States and NATO. The report comes as the war in Ukraine continues to fan the tensions between the West and Russia. Concerns also swirl over Moscow's potential to use nuclear weapons against Kyiv or its neighboring NATO member states. Today, 9 countries possess nuclear weapons. Here they are on the world map: the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, France, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. To understand the nuclear stockpiles possessed by Russia, let's take you back to 1945. In 1945, the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing over 210,000 people. Two weeks after the attacks, Japan surrendered, thus ending the Second World War. In the years that followed, many of the survivors of the nuclear attack faced leukemia, cancer, or other terrible side effects from the radiation. However, this was not the world's first nuclear explosion. The first atomic bomb exploded on the 16th of July in 1945 in New Mexico. This was part of the Manhattan Project. A US government program showcased in Christopher Nolan's Oscar-winning film Oppenheimer. It marked the beginning of the nuclear arms race. After the 1945 bombings of the Japanese cities, the USSR dramatically accelerated its atomic weapons program. It successfully tested its first plutonium bomb in 1949. New hostilities emerged between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies. For over 40 years, the two superpowers threatened each other with nuclear weapons. A threatening nuclear arms race that advanced over the years. In 1991, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev sat down at a table inside the Kremlin to deliver a monumental speech. Gorbachev announced that after 74 years, one of the world's most powerful nations, the Soviet Union, no longer existed and would break up into 15 separate countries. The collapse of the Soviet Union left 30,000 nuclear weapons spread across the territories of 4 newly sovereign states: Belarus, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Ukraine. Russia kept its weapons. Ukraine acceded to the Treaty of the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or NPT, in 1994. As a non-nuclear weapon state, it transferred its nuclear warheads to Russia. That eventually emerged as the sole nuclear successor of the USSR. That puts into perspective the events that have followed from that day to this. Russia, which inherited the Soviet Union's nuclear weapons, has the world's biggest store of nuclear warheads currently. The United States used the nuclear warheads just once in 1945 on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the world witnessed its effect and the destruction. As of 2023, according to the Federation of American Scientists, Putin's Russia controls around 5,889 such warheads, compared with 5,244 controlled by US President Joe Biden. China has 410 warheads, France 290, and Britain 225. These numbers paint the dystopian universe in the making, where both Moscow and Washington hold the power to destroy our world many times over. The war in Ukraine has led to a resurgence of fears about the use of nukes. 3 weeks into the attack, Russia said it fired hypersonic missiles from its Kinzhal system to destroy an underground weapons storage site in West Ukraine. The strike marked the first use of the nuclear-capable advanced weapons system in the Ukraine war. Then, in April, the Russian Defense Ministry tested a new long-range nuclear missile. The Sarmat, dubbed Satan II by Western analysts, is touted as an unambiguous threat to Russia's enemies, particularly the United States. Putin has called it invincible. It is among Russia's next-generation missiles that also include the Kinzhal and Avangard hypersonic missiles. This year, in March, Russia's defense ministry announced the successful test fire of a Yars intercontinental ballistic nuclear missile. The announcement came just a day after Putin's warnings on a nuclear conflict. Yars is capable of delivering multiple nuclear warheads, each capable of targeting different objectives. The world witnessed the 23-meter-long missile during a military parade on Victory Day at Red Square in Moscow last year. With the completion of its tests, Putin has just further strengthened his nuclear arsenal. But Russia's nuclear capabilities are just not restricted to war zones. Russia and China are planning a nuclear power plant on the moon by 2035. Yuri Borisov, the head of Russia's space agency Roscosmos, says that Moscow and Beijing are jointly working on a lunar program and that Russia was able to contribute with its expertise on nuclear space energy. Moscow's nuclear ambitions are soaring higher just before the Russian elections. Putin has repeatedly talked about his readiness to use nuclear weapons since the Ukraine invasion in 2022. In his latest interview with the Russian state media on March 13th, Putin says Moscow is ready to use nuclear weapons if there is a threat to the existence of the Russian state, but there has never been such a need. Putin's comments came in a week when Russia will hold its presidential election. With most of his domestic opponents dead, exiled, or in custody, Putin is all but guaranteed to win in a landslide, reaffirming the tight control that he has established during his 24-year rule.